National Phenology Network's Visualization Tool webinar. Today we have two of us here on your webinar team. My name is Erin Postumus. I'm an Outreach Associate and the Liaison to the Fish and Wildlife Service here at the National Coordinating Office in Tucson. And presenting for us today is Lee Marsh. He's our IT Coordinator, and he'll be giving you a run-through of our brand new visualization tool. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lee.
Cool. Hey, everybody. This is my first time presenting on one of these webinars, so please do bear with me as we walk through the tool here. So that said, let's get right into the tool, take a look at it. We're going to be talking a little bit today about the features and functionalities of the tool. And first, I just kind of want to start off describing the tool a little bit here. The purpose of this tool when we built it was to kind of provide a visual means for people to kind of explore the data. So it's not really a tool for getting real deep into the science, but it is sort of a way for people to very easily and in kind of a fun way explore the data, try to sort of start to look for patterns that you might see in the data. We designed this tool with the audience in mind of land managers and scientists. But as we started developing the tool, we saw opportunities to sort of broaden the audience to our casual observers. And you can kind of see that come out in some of the features and functionalities here as we start walking through this. So we have a look at the tool here. This is what you see when you first open up. And as you can see, there's a map of the United States. And each of the states is highlighted here. And in the center, you see a bubble with a number, and that actually describes the number of sites where people are recording observations in each of those sites, or each of those states rather. And that just kind of gives you an idea of the geographic distribution of where our observers are at. So you can actually click on the state to expand it, and give it a second here, like Erin prefaced this with. It kind of takes a little bit longer to load when we got the GoToMeeting running at the same time. But what you see here is an expansion of the locations of the sites. So everything's kind of broken down further, and you can actually continue to click on those bubbles, those group bubbles of sites, and get a closer idea of where that data is distributed. So if I really zoom in here in Tucson, that's the home location of us here at the USA-NPN. You can see all the different places where we have sites. And as these break down, you'll see that you start to get these red dots. And what that indicates is that that is just an individual site. And you can click those to get a little more information. Specifically, the site name, if it belongs to a group, and if I can find one, the number of individuals at that site, and let's see here. And if I could find a site with some data at it, you can actually see the number of observations at that location. So this is kind of just a nice way to start to look at the data, find your sites, see who your neighbors maybe are, but it doesn't really tell you anything too interesting. So what we could maybe look at is an example. So maybe what we could do is look and see if the timing of bumblebee activity and flowers blooming in the Midwest is relatively synchronized. So let's take a look at that. And we'll start to explore this control panel on the left-hand side that you'll see here. Now, the crux of this control panel is this menu right here, the filter menu. And what this allows you to do is actually set the parameters on the data that you want to look at when you're viewing the map here. So let's say I specifically want to look at 2010 to 2015. That's most of our contemporary data. And that's the only filter that you absolutely have to set is the year filter. So if I add that to the map, it expands these further options here. So you see these different drop-downs here. Animal types and plant types are kind of exactly what you would expect. You've got a list of animal types, a list of plant types. And you can use that to prune down this list of species. So if I only wanted to look at birds, for example, I could select birds in the animal list here. The third option, partners, allows you to specify, it actually has two functions. So you can specify groups. So we've got a whole list of all of our partner groups here, ATCs, Acadia National Park, so on and so forth. And this will prune the list of species to the ones that those groups are actually collecting data on. But in addition to that, it will also filter the data that is actually displayed on the map. So let's look at that by selecting those species. So we want to look at bumblebee. And we also want to look at, let's pick a flower species, common lilac. We have a lot of data for that species. So I add that to the map. And then I press the Execute Filter button. And what you can see here is distribution of those data collected across the United States. Now, we said that we wanted to collect that data only in the Midwest. So let's see here. There's a couple ways you can do that. The first way is you can manually select that. So if you look at the tools over in the right-hand corner, you've got the ability to draw a little rectangle around whatever area that you're interested in. So if I were to draw that over roughly the Midwest, I get all the data from that area. And I could do other sections if I wanted to. But that's not as cool as some of the other options we have here. If you look over in the Layers panel, what you have is a bunch of different options that allow you to set an overlay on the map that will select certain specific regions of area. So for example, the National Climate Assessment Region, if I click this, we'll see now on the map, each of those areas is highlighted with a little border. And so if I click the Midwestern states, you'll see all the data gets pruned down just to those states. And so I could select other ones if I wanted to, but we're just going to look at the Midwest. So you right-click to unselect an area. So now that we have our data filtered down, we've got the year set, the species set, and the area set. We go to the visualization control panel. So you open this up. It kind of displays the different options that you have in terms of visualizing the data. So if we want to kind of compare a bumblebee activity to flowering activity, let's look at the calendar visualization. And so what you see here is a number of controls at the top. And this kind of lets you get more specific about what specific types of phenophases and for what periods of time you want to actually compare. So let's look at 2013. And for common lilac, we want open flowers. So we add that. And likewise for bumblebees, we want flower visitation. So we add that. So now that we have those things selected, we can press the Visualize button. And so what you see here is a calendar of that activity. So at the bottom you can see the different months of the year laid out, and each of those bars represents an observation within that time frame where that activity was recorded. So as you can see here, the bumblebees really weren't collecting pollen until the flowers were blooming. And so you can see some synchrony there. That's kind of what we're looking for. Now let's say you wanted to compare between different years. You can select up to 2 years at a time to compare phenophases. So let's look at 2012. So add that to the calendar and click Visualize. And so now you can see here in the label, common lilac, open flowers 2012, bumblebee, flower visitation 2012, and likewise for 2013. And again, you can see synchrony between those events, and that actually makes sense here because, as you may know, 2012 was sort of an uncharacteristically warm and early spring. So it's kind of a neat pattern. You can see that here in the data. And another thing that you might be interested in seeing is how frequently this data was actually being selected, or observed rather. because this shows you the positive observations, but it doesn't really show you the full gamut of times when people are actually going out and observing. So since we encourage people to collect negative data, you can view that by just turning this little checkbox on and off. And with that, you can kind of see that, yes, observers were actually going out throughout the year and collecting data, and still you can see some synchrony between these events. So this is really kind of a cool way to compare patterns between different species or compare different years and see if things are happening at different times. And you've got a few other options on this menu too. There's some controls here at the bottom to control how the graphics are sort of displayed. So if the label is too small for you to read, you can make it bigger or smaller. If it's kind of overlapping with your bar, you can change its position relative to the activity bar. And you can change the band size too, so I can actually make that bigger or smaller. And that's kind of helpful for when you're plotting a whole lot of data on here. If you added like 12 or 15 phenophases, it can get kind of confusing to read. Additionally, you've got the download button. So if you wanted to save this graphic, you just click this button. And as you can see in my browser here, maybe I don't know if you can see that in the webinar, but I've got a little file that downloaded to my hard drive of this graphic. So that's the calendar visualization. But if we come back here to the map, there's some interesting stuff that we can look at here as well. Now, when we first launched the tool, you saw that the distribution of sites was grouped into these bubbles. But as you look here, you can see that the numbers are quite a bit higher. And that's because those bubbles are actually representing the number of observation records rather than the number of sites. But you have some other options with this version of the map interface as well. There's a settings control panel over here on the left-hand side. So if we click that, you can see we've got a couple of options here. The first is cluster markers. So, we just talked about these grouped bubbles here. If I wanted to see all the individual points, you can toggle that here. So if I change that to no, you can see that all the individual sites are laid out and plotted on the map. And it actually floats to the top the locations where there's the most amount of data. And you can actually get a closer look at the station still here in this view. So if I zoom in, I'm looking at this whole set of observations where people are looking at bumblebees and common lilacs. If I click or mouse over rather one of these bubbles, you can see this legend pops up in the lower right-hand corner. And what that shows you is the relative density of observations at that site as compared to the other sites that are currently being graphed. So you can see there's 12 bumblebee observations at this site. So compared to the max for all the locations that we're looking at, it's not too many. But if I come over here and look at this station, or rather, I'm trying to find a good one that's got a lot of data at it. This one in Minneapolis has 1,300 bumblebee observations. And you can kind of also see that in the hue of the station and not just the relative position to it as compared to the others here. The little green circle around the station marker indicates that there's more than one species that we have selected being observed at that site. So like you can see at this station here, someone's home, just outside Minneapolis, they're looking at a common lilac and they're observing bumblebees. So let's turn the clusters back on. And I mentioned earlier that this is the number of records, but you can toggle between that. So if I prefer to see the number of sites that are grouped together, I can just change that using this setting. And that's kind of useful if you want to see if there's some superstar station that is recording a whole lot of data, or if there's just a bunch of stations that have really no observations at them. You can kind of get a feel for that by switching between that setting. Species tag title is just really a personal preference. When we added these species, add these tags at the top that tells you the number of observation records for those species. I and then you have the common names listed up there, but if you prefer to see the scientific names, you can switch that with this setting. And then this last one is a little bit hard to articulate, especially since we haven't looked at the scatter plot graph yet. But the idea is that in some of the visualizations, what we're going to do is we're going to prune out the data points that don't have a no preceding the yes. And this is really kind of relevant when you're thinking about the onset date of a particular phenophase, because you want to be able to say that the onset date was within a certain margin of error, and you can kind of get that with a no that precedes the yes data point. So by default, we only show those observations that have a no preceding the yes. But if you really want to look at all the data, you can change that in this setting here between yes and no. So this is kind of cool. I've got this data laid out in the Midwest, and maybe I want to look at it later, or I want to share it with someone, and so there's controls for doing that as well. So on these tools on the right-hand side here, you've got the share button. And if I click that, what it does is it generates a link that I can copy-paste, and I can save that in an email, I can send it to a friend, whatever. But if you actually visit that link in another browser, what it will pull up is the same visualization tool, but with all of these settings selected by default. So, you know, someone would see common lilac and bumblebee, the year range, they would see the geographic area that we have selected. So it's a really easy way to just sort of share something that you found interesting with your friends or neighbors or whatever. Additionally, you might want to dig into this data more. You know, we saw this pattern, presumably, between bumblebees and lilacs, and you know, you might be more interested in analyzing that. So if you really want to get into the guts of this, there's the export tool. So if I click this, what it's going to do is open up a new browser window, and it's going to take you to the download data tool, right? So it pre-selects the data download tool with all of those filters that you set in the visualization tool. So again, I looked at the Midwest, those 2 species, and for those dates, and you can see here, that's already pre-populated here into the download tool. So I'm not going to go through the whole process here, but you can select summarized data or raw data. You can select some additional data fields that you may or may not be interested in looking at. You can look at ancillary data about sites, plants, the observer, a number of things here. So you just provide your email, and then you click the download data button, and then you can look at that data in Excel. So coming back to the visualization tool here, there's really one last piece of functionality to show off here. So there's also the reset button here on the tools on the right-hand side. So if I select that, it takes you back to the initial state of the map where you've got all of the states laid out and observations distributed by site. So let's look at the scatter plot. That's really the last piece of functionality here. So we can look at a species for which we have quite a bit of data. Let's look at breaking leaf bud for red maple. So if I select the same date range, and then in species I come down here and select red maple, add that to my selection, and then execute filter. It's going to again show this distribution of data across the United States, this time for red maple. And predictably, you can see that most of the data is kind of in the eastern U.S., except for this random point that someone put their station in the ocean. So that's fantastic. Anyways, we want to look at the scatter plot. So if we open that up again from the visualization menu here, you can see it's pre-populated with the species that we had selected, and then you've got a full gamut of all the phenophases that are available for that species. So we want to look at breaking leaf bud. And then what it's going to do is it's going to show you a number of different abiotic variables that you can plot against. So you've got latitude, longitude, elevation, a bunch of different climatic variables, and day length, a few other random things. So let's look at latitude first. And if I click Visualize, so what you see here is those plots, or those points plotted against each other on this graph. And on the y-axis here, you have onset date, and so that's going to be the day of year. And then on the x-axis, you have the latitude. So you can kind of see here that as your latitude gets higher, you're prone to maybe a later onset date. And if you do fit line, it'll actually draw the regression line through those data points and even mention to you the r-squared value. So that's kind of cool because it lets you kind of evaluate the relationship between these different variables. Another one that's kind of interesting for this species in particular is, let's see here, Tmax winter. So Tmax winter is the average high temperatures for the winter months preceding the onset date. So as you can kind of see here, it indicates that maybe you're looking at earlier onset dates in warmer winters. And you can look at all kinds of stuff here. Some of the stuff doesn't necessarily indicate anything very conclusive. Accumulated precipitation, for example, this isn't a real strong graph. And that's kind of expected because it's a value that's just going to keep growing and growing as the year goes on. And you can actually look at multiple phenophases at the same time. So if I wanted to look at open flowers, I could do that as well. It takes just a second here. It's got a fair bit of data. But now you can see those data points for those two separate phenophases plotted at the same time. Let's look at latitude again. And you can actually do this for multiple species as well. So if I wanted to compare lilacs or birds or anything, you could put them all on the graph at the same time. And just like the calendar visualization, this also has the option to download this as a graphic that you might share later. So that said, I mean, that covers most of the functionality of the tool. And as you can see, it's really kind of an easy way to start to look at the data. We looked at some different examples, compared some different patterns, and it's really pretty easy to use the tool, especially once you get the hang of it. Something that we're looking to do in the future, though, is to add more visualization. So right now you've got this tool, you've got the calendar and the scatter plot. Something that we'd like to do in the future is show the onset dates on a map, so you can kind of see geographically when phenophases are happening. There's the possibility of doing map overlays if we implement something like that, where you could look at climate data on top of that as well. Another thing that we want to do is integrate climate data into the calendar, so you can kind of see how that climate data might be reflected in the activity of phenophases. And there's also a help page for all this, right? So this is actually the launch page. This is the page where you would access this tool if you wanted to look at it in your own time. And in addition to being able to access the tool here, there's a bunch of other information about it. So, if you missed something in this presentation, or you weren't clear about something, there's tutorial steps that kind of describe the different things you might do to get the data that you want to look at. A lot of the different controls and menus are described here. Probably most importantly, though, is on the scatter plot, there were all those 8 biotic variables, and this actually provides the definitions for those. So if you're not clear about what we mean when we say precipitation spring or Tmax fall, you can refer to this page, and it helps kind of clarify what those variables are. In addition to that, our lovely Erin has so graciously created a number of different tutorials, again, kind of walking through the functionality of the tool. So if you missed something today or you weren't clear about something, you can check out these YouTube tutorials that kind of describe how you might use the visualization tool. So that pretty much sums it up. So at this point, I guess I would open the floor to questions, comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lee, for the great presentation. We have had a few questions come in so far, and you're welcome to keep chatting those in. We have plenty of time to get to these questions. So the first one, going back to the scatter plots, Ingrid was wondering, where do the climate data come from? So can you talk about that? I think that's mentioned on the...
Sure, yeah, that's mentioned in the information page here. And what we do is we get that data from DayMet. So when people add their locations to our database, we go out, we contact the web services that DayMet so graciously provides us with, and we cache that information in our own database and associate it with those observations. So that's what is able to provide that climate. Some of those variables are aggregated on our own, based on our own sort of methods. For example, GDD, DayMet doesn't provide that directly, but they do have the daily max temperature across the United States. So we just calculate that ourselves, and we base that off of, I think it's a 0 Celsius threshold.
Great. And then another question about the scatter plot. Can you rotate the X and Y axes on the scatter plot?
Not yet. That's an interesting suggestion. Right now, it's just we only have the onset day of year on the y-axis. I don't know if there's any plans to be able to switch them, but one thing that we would like to do is provide more variables on the y-axis. So you might be able to look at some other interesting patterns besides onset date relative to whatever it is you're looking at.
And then going back to just the basic map, is there a way to filter for phenophases on the map? I think that's one thing we didn't show.
Oh, yes. My apologies. Actually, I should have covered that during the presentation. But you've got the species here at the top, the tag. So we're looking at red maple, and you can see there's about 260,000 records. But if you click that, it'll show you the full gamut of phenophases that are available for that species. And you can select all of them. You can select none of them. You can narrow it down to specific ones that you might want to look at. So if I only wanted to see breaking leaf buds and leaves, I would check those in the list, click the tag again, and now you can see the number's been updated. It's 48,000 records, and these bubbles, if you caught that, updated their values as well. And something else that bears worth mentioning, I don't really like to highlight the flaws of the tool, but it is one of these things that I think is worth mentioning because it is a bit confusing. In the list of phenophases here, you'll see some stuff that's conflicting, some stuff that's repeated in some cases. And the reason for that is it's based on the way that the data is structured in our database, right? So some of these phenophases have changed their method over time. So we might have the phenophase more than once in our database. And in other cases, we have outside data sets that have a similar phenophase, but with the same name. And so we're tracking all of that here, and we track them separately. And we haven't come up with a good solution yet in terms of how to distinguish those. So it is one confusing bit because you'll see some of these are a little bit repeated, or they might seem overlapping. Other ones are phased out. For example, we don't use this 50% of leaves fallen phenophase anymore. So you'd only actually see data for that if you were looking at records back in like 2010 and 2011. So if you're ever using this tool and you're graphing on the scatter plot or the calendar visualization and you're not getting data for some particular phenophase, it might be because it's one of these older phenophases.
Another question, is there any way to search for the synchronicity of phenophases across species, for example, bird nest building versus specific tree flowering? I don't think there's a way to actually search for that. You have to really know which species you're looking for before you can look at those kind of relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the use of the tool is that, we don't have a comprehensive list of these synchronous events yet, or as the case may be, when events are getting out of sync. So the purpose of the tool is to kind of give you an opportunity to ask those kind of questions about specific bird species, for example, and say, hey, let's look and see if American robin or blue jay or whatever is in sync with these other events that need to happen at the same time. One thing you can do, however, is I showed the download tool earlier, and it's probably not necessarily an easy way to search for synchrony, but you could look at all of the data points that way and maybe, I don't know, use filters in Excel or something to compare different types of events. But really, this tool is kind of the way to start exploring those types of patterns.
Another question, can you select best reported, for example, spring indicator? I think that probably means which species would be the best spring indicators?
I don't think so. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Again, I think if you're looking to see which species are very indicative of spring activity, this is another great opportunity to say, I wonder if this event for this species is really happening when I would expect to see spring. And you could even do something like compare it to your local area. If you're living in Illinois and you know that spring was starting to pick up sometime in April, you could start loading species into the visualization tool and kind of compare their activity to April, what you know to be true, and see, hey, this is really happening during April, so that's a pretty good indication of spring happening. I will say that common lilac is something that we have such a proliferated amount of data about that it's generally used to indicate the start of spring. So that's a good species as a sort of starting point or calibration species for that sort of analysis.
Another, this is more feedback. When you first load up the map, I'm just wondering how you can tell what the numbers mean. So maybe if you could go back and do a reset just to show there is a little bit of information when you roll over those numbers. It will tell you.
Yeah.
Because that indicates the number of stations.
Right. So if you put your mouse cursor over the bubble itself, the state doesn't do it, but if you put it over the bubble, it'll give you the postal abbreviation and the number of sites. So, I mean, you've already got the number of sites in the bubble, but that provides a little additional context.
And then when you get down to the site level and you do a click on that site, you will get more information about what's there as well.
Yes, that's correct. And some of those things aren't so explicit in the tool, and for things like that, that's kind of why we provided this help page, because it talks about stuff like this on this page: the state, count markers, the group markers, and so on.
Is the tool compatible with all computer systems, browsers?
Generally so. We tested this on Safari, Chrome, Opera, Firefox, even Internet Explorer a little bit. And it is quite a contrast from our previous tool. If you know anything about the history of our organization, and specifically our visualization tool, we had a previous iteration of this tool a few years ago, and it was built in Adobe Flex or Flash, and that's not so compatible with the Apple platform. But we've rebuilt the tool in a new platform, so it should work pretty much on all platforms, so Apple users included.
All right. One thing that, just because we have a few minutes, we might show is a little bit more on the partner group settings. So I thought we might, since we have a bunch of people on here from California, we could show as an example, just looking at some of the California Phenology Project data. So maybe we could just pull up, maybe just from maybe 2014 or 2013, just to show an example of what that might look like.
Sure. So again, we go back into the filter menu, we set the date range, and yeah, we alluded to this earlier in the presentation. You've got the partner drop-down, and you've got a list of all the partners with which we work. And if we search here for California, we get California Phenology Project. So we'll select that, add it to the map and execute filter. And I think I might have found a little bug here. I'm just going to restart the tool. I've noticed sometimes this happens where if you've already got like a filter selected previously and you've used the refresh tool, the data will drop out. So I'm just going to reset the thing through the browser. So again, walking through the steps here. Right, so now we've got the data for the California Phenology Project. And again, so if I zoom in, I can look specifically whether the observations are in Northern California, San Francisco, Southern California, so on and so forth. And what's interesting about this too is if I go into, say for example, the calendar, I've got a list of all of the species that that group is looking at. So let's see. What might be a good species to look at, Erin?
Maybe coyote brush. Maybe all phenophases?
Yes. We haven't looked at that yet either. So if I select coyote brush, all phenophases, click add, it's going to add all of those. Oh, yes. And I need to select a year and a visualize. And so now you can see the full range of activity for that species in 2013 for that partner group. So if some average Joe observer was also looking at coyote brush, that would be excluded from this data set. And this is really good for partner groups to if they want to sort of look specifically at the data that they've been working with rather than trying to dig through the data files. And again, you can look at the negative data as well to see the full extent of activity.
Yeah, so this is a really great resource to be able to share your group's data back with your group. You can just download this graph and then email it out to your group members. And then also just generally, if you want to know how many observations your group has collected for different years, you can get that pretty easily from the tool as well.
Cool.
Okay, well I think that was it. We'll just give it another little bit of time in case anyone has any last questions. There will be a survey that will come up at the end of the webinar when you close it, and you're welcome to leave any other feedback there as well.
Yeah, and you know, something that we would be interested in hearing is just feedback about the tool. And that might be something that comes after you've had an opportunity to play with it yourself. But you know, if some piece of functionality doesn't make sense to you, or you have suggestions about some visualization that you'd like to see in the future, we're certainly open to fielding all manner of suggestions. So.
All right. Well, this webinar is recorded, as I mentioned, and there'll be an email coming your way tomorrow that will have that recording if you'd like to share it with anyone. Thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you on a future webinar.
Thanks, everybody.